Ever had that weird feeling, like you're here, but maybe not really here?
Mhm.
Well, imagine taking that feeling way, way further to the point where it's not just a feeling, but this solid belief that you've actually died.
Yeah, it sounds quite unsettling.
Right. So today we're diving deep into something called Cotard syndrome. It's also known as Cotard delusion sometimes.
It's this pretty rare psychiatric condition, and it's all about these nihilistic delusions. Basically, the person is convinced they're dead, or maybe decaying, or just gone, obliterated.
Exactly. And the difference between that internal certainty and, well, the fact they're still walking around is just huge.
Absolutely. And we've got some really interesting sources to help us unpack this. We're looking at a case study from Curious. There's a PubMed abstract analyzing, I think, over 300 cases,
Wow.
a historical piece from Comprehensive Psychiatry, the usual background from Wikipedia, plus the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy talking about delusions generally.
And there's more, right? A letter in psychiatry online and even a personal account from Reddit.
That's right, a very personal AMA, which gives a different kind of insight.
Okay, so our mission here is to really try and get a handle on this odd affliction, as one study calls it.
Yeah, looking at how it shows up, what might cause it, how experts see it, versus how someone living it feels.
Yeah, and importantly, what can actually be done to help. So let's start right there. What is Cotard's syndrome fundamentally?
Well, that Curious Case report gives a really stark example. It's about a 60-year-old man. He had schizophrenia and he ended up needing emergency care because he was getting aggressive.
Okay.
And a key part of his presentation, he was absolutely certain, repeatedly stating, "I am dead."
Just, I am dead. That's incredibly direct. And the report stresses these aren't just like fleeting thoughts, right?
Yeah.
They're described as unique psychopathological experiences.
Deeply felt.
Deeply felt, exactly. And while that core belief is central, it's not like everyone experiences it identically. It seems to be more of a
A
spectrum.
spectrum. How so? Well, Yamada and colleagues mentioned in that Curious report, they actually proposed 3 stages. There's a germination phase first.
Germination, like seeds growing.
Kind of. It might start with prodromal symptoms like depression getting worse or even hypochondria, so worrying a lot about health.
Mm-hmm.
Then comes the blooming stage. That's when the full-blown delusions of negation, believing you don't exist or are dead, really take root.
In their stages.
That's the chronic stage. This could mean ongoing depression or the delusions just persist over time.
So it can build up gradually. And it's interesting, that specific case in Curious links it to schizophrenia.
That's a key point. Cotard's often shows up alongside other conditions. It's not always isolated. And just for some history, the Comprehensive Psychiatry Abstract reminds us this isn't new. Jules Cotard, a French neurologist back in the late 1800s.
Oh, right, hence the name.
Exactly. He was the first one to really describe it. So doctors have known about this for, well, over a century, even if we're still learning about it.
Okay, so that's the clinical picture.
Yeah.
But what's it actually like from the inside? That Reddit AMA you mentioned sounds fascinating. The user was, am I dead?
Yeah. And their story is, well, it's quite something. They attempted suicide about a year and a half before doing the AMA.
Oh, wow.
And since then, they've had this really fluctuating sense of being alive or dead. It wasn't constant.
Fluctuating. So not always 100% certain they were dead.
Apparently not. They actually said, at the moment, I am erring on the side of being alive, but at times I've been 99% sure that I am dead. That back and forth is really striking.
That's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And did they talk about how they, manage day-to-day life with that belief?
They did. They mentioned feeling like they had to act as if I am alive, because if they didn't, the consequences could be bad, like ending up back in the hospital.
So there's a level of awareness there, or at least pragmatism. Like, I feel dead, but I need to pretend I'm not to function. That must create some serious internal conflict.
It really suggests a complex relationship between the belief and their outward actions. It's something we see discussed with delusions more generally.
Did they have any theories about why they felt this way?
Yes, they shared some personal ideas, like maybe they were in some kind of afterlife that just looks like regular life,
Huh.
or maybe they needed to learn something specific to move on, or even that it was a punishment for the suicide attempt.
That's incredibly personal and kind of heartbreaking, really, trying to make sense of such a profound shift in reality.
It is, and they described those first few months after the attempt, believing nothing was real anymore. Just think about navigating your world when you fundamentally doubt its reality.
Everything would feel off, unstable. Did they feel the label Cotards fit them perfectly?
They actually touched on that. They said it might not be a perfect fit, but it was the closest thing they could find to describe what they were going through, which again points to this idea of it being a spectrum.
Right. Different flavors of the same core issue. And it's a contrast, isn't it? This person engaging online, articulating their experience versus the curious case, the man who was acutely distressed, aggressive.
It absolutely highlights the range of presentations. Which brings us to, well, what could be causing this? What's happening in the brain?
Yeah, what do we know about the biology?
Honestly, the curious abstract is quite upfront that the pathophysiology, the underlying mechanism, is still pretty elusive. A lot of the ideas are speculative at this point.
So no definitive answer yet.
Not really, but they do stress how important neurological checks are, brain scans, things like that, to make sure there isn't some other physical cause like a tumor or injury.
Rule out the organic stuff first.
Mm-mm.
Makes sense. Did they find anything in the curious patient's scans?
They did find something interesting. They observed cerebral atrophy, basically, some shrinking or loss of brain tissue. It was on the right side and also bilaterally, so on both sides, particularly in the frontal lobe.
The frontal lobe.
Yeah.
Okay, that's involved in executive functions, personality, right? How might that link to feeling dead?
Well, the thinking is that damage there could mess with crucial neural circuits. It might disrupt how we perceive ourselves, our sense of self.
Okay.
The frontal lobe is like our brain's control center, helps us test reality. If that's damaged, our fundamental self-awareness could go awry.
So the wiring gets crossed somehow.
Potentially. They also suggest it could interfere with connections between the temporal lobe involved in senses and memory and the limbic system, which handles emotions.
Emotions.
Right. If that communication breaks down, you might fundamentally misunderstand yourself, other people, even places. It could lead to this profound sense of negation, this nihilism. The brain just can't make sense of its own existence anymore.
That actually provides a plausible, if scary, potential explanation. If those core reality checking and emotional circuits are off, maybe I am dead becomes a conclusion the brain reaches.
It's a disturbing possibility. And the Curious report also mentioned that Cotards can pop up in cases of really severe depression, too.
Right. You mentioned the co-occurrence. How does that work?
Well, they noted that sometimes, if severe depression goes untreated for a long time, these nihilistic delusions can emerge later on. Maybe following those 3 stages we talked about, depression deepens, then the nihilistic beliefs bloom, maybe settling into a chronic state.
So depression itself might, in extreme cases, pave the way for it. Let's zoom out a bit. How does Cotard's fit into the bigger picture of delusions in mental health?
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is helpful here. It defines delusions broadly as these unusual beliefs that show up when someone's in psychological distress, often symptoms of psychiatric disorders.
And do they mention Cotard specifically?
They do. They give an example of a woman who was absolutely convinced she was dead. She was in the hospital and wondered if maybe it was heaven.
Wow, and she linked it to the flu.
Yeah, she thought maybe a bout of flu had caused her death. It shows how these powerful beliefs can kind of co-opt ordinary experiences into their narrative.
And the encyclopedia mentions something about conviction, right?
Yes, that people usually state these delusions with real sincerity, real belief, even if their behavior doesn't always seem to match up 100%.
Like the Reddit user acting alive while feeling dead.
Exactly. And this actually sparks a whole philosophical debate, which the encyclopedia touches on too. Are delusions genuinely irrational? Or are they even beliefs in the way we normally think of them?
What did the philosophers say?
Well, some, like Brendan Marr, have argued that maybe delusions are false but reasonable.
False but reasonable. How?
The idea is, given the person's incredibly strange and distorted inner experiences, maybe faulty sensory input or processing the delusion might actually be the most logical conclusion their brain can form from that distorted input. It's trying to make sense of nonsense, essentially.
That's a fascinating perspective. Their reasoning process isn't necessarily broken, but the data it's working with is corrupted.
Something like that. And the encyclopedia also notes that people with delusions sometimes show certain reasoning biases, like maybe jumping to conclusions faster, needing less evidence, and specifically relevant to Cotards, sometimes attributing negative things disproportionately to themselves.
Okay, so we have this incredibly complex condition, possibly linked to brain changes, severe depression, distorted experiences. How is it treated? Is there hope?
There is. The PubMed abstract, looking at those hundreds of cases, found that several treatments have shown success.
Like what?
Pharmacotherapy. So medications, mainly antipsychotics and antidepressants, and also electroconvulsive therapy, ECT.
ECT often gets a bad rap, but it can be very effective for severe conditions, right?
It can be, especially for severe depression or catatonia, which can sometimes overlap. And the curious case fits this. Their patient was started on risperidone, an antipsychotic.
Okay.
They also got benztropine, but that's usually more for managing potential side effects from the antipsychotic.
Are there other medication approaches?
Interestingly, yes. That letter in Psychiatry Online reported a case where Cotard's was treated successfully with something different, a dopamine agonist called pramipexole.
A dopamine agonist. Isn't that sometimes used for Parkinson's? Usually we hear about blocking dopamine with antipsychotics.
Exactly. It suggests the brain chemistry involved might be more complex than just one single pathway, and maybe different approaches work for different people. It's definitely an alternative strategy.
Good to know there are options. And you mentioned earlier it can occur with other syndromes.
Right. The curious report noted it can co-occur with Popgrass's syndrome.
That's the imposter delusion, right? Believing loved ones have been replaced.
That's the one. And the Reddit user also thought there might be some overlap in their own experience. It suggests these strange reality-distorting syndromes might sometimes share underlying brain issues.
Any other examples?
Wikipedia mentions a case study. Someone had a motorcycle accident and afterwards believed they were in hell.
In hell.
Yeah, and also had feelings of unreality and being dead. But significantly, those feelings apparently got better when they were treated for depression.
Which brings us back to that link between mood and these extreme beliefs.
Okay.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together.
Mm-hmm.
Cotard syndrome, this rare, definitely odd condition, core belief is being dead or non-existent.
Right. We see links to things like schizophrenia, severe depression, maybe specific brain changes, especially in the frontal lobe.
And it manifests differently from acute distress to someone more functional, but wrestling with the belief internally.
But crucially, there are treatments. Medications, both typical and sometimes alternative ones, and ECT have shown they can help improve things.
Yeah, the PubMed abstract stressed it's often treatable, even if it's challenging to diagnose sometimes.
And the Curious report really underlined the need for more research to figure out the nuts and bolts of it all.
Absolutely. And, we really have to appreciate the bravery of people like that Reddit user, sharing something so personal, so deeply unsettling.
It gives us an insight you just can't get from a clinical description alone. It's invaluable, even if it's just one person's experience.
Definitely. So maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. Cotard syndrome sits at this strange intersection of brain function, psychology, maybe even philosophy.
Yeah.
Given everything we've talked about, the neurology, the distorted experiences, the existential nature of the delusion, what does this condition tell us about how fragile or how constructed our own basic sense of being alive actually is?
It definitely makes you pause and think about the foundations of our reality, doesn't it? Something to explore further, perhaps, looking into how neuroscience and philosophy tackle the whole concept of delusion and the self.